Thank you. Can you hear me okay? All right. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation and the excuse to come from California. I really am so happy to be here again. So to get started, all right, we were joking at dinner last night that each one of us says, my countess, my Stan, like we claim them, which feels like perhaps an overstep, particularly standing in this room with, they're your countess, I know. But this is my countess. This is Lady Alice Spencer Stanley Edgerton, the Dowager Countess of Derby. And even though later in her life she goes on to have other titles, she continues to identify herself as the fifth Dowager Countess of Derby throughout her entire life. So in the early 1630s, probably 1632, 1633, a young John Milton wrote a mask entertainment in honor of Lady Alice. She was once the mistress of this home that we're in today, although primarily at the time that she was the Countess, Latham Hall was their primary seat. But she did spend time here as well. Milton's goal in this masque was to celebrate her matriarchal authority that she wielded on behalf of her family, and the original performance was done by her grandchildren playing the parts. So in this masque, he wrote, "Mark what radiant state she spreads in circles round her shining throne, shooting her beams like silver threads. This is she alone, sitting like a goddess bright in the center of her light. I will bring you where she sits, clad in splendor as befits her deity. Such a rural queen, all Arcadia hath not seen." And these lines so beautifully capture Lady Alice's influence, and she's been very closely associated with these lines for the last 400 years. So she's long been known to literary scholars as a patroness, as a subject, of course, and as a muse. But I am here to proudly say I am a historian, not a literary scholar. So when I first met her, I wanted to know about her life and the context that she came from, not just the lines that she inspired. I didn't want to use Alice as a portal to meet John Milton. I already knew John Milton. I wanted to use Milton as a portal to meet Alice. And then I wanted to use Alice as a way to understand the 16th and 17th century, to understand the political and the religious and the cultural moment that is the English Renaissance and the Reformation. Because I thought that by looking at that world through her eyes, I might be able to see something that we don't typically get to see. And so it was really, this poetry that led me to her, and then she led me into the Reformation and the Renaissance. So I started to kind of use the historical record to build a world around her. And this meant, first and foremost, kind of placing her within her constellation of her family. And so this just is a very scaled back compared to the complicated network that you saw earlier, although she certainly, through her marriage to Ferdinando Stanley, the 5th Earl of Derby, connects upward to the large, gigantic family tree that you just saw in the previous talk. And so it won't surprise you that, men are easier to find than women. So I started with, again, the men, and then started to build out from there. So let me introduce you to some of the men in her life. This, on the image here, this is Ferdinando Stanley, the 5th Earl of Derby. You saw his portrait in the state dining room. They were married. It was an arranged marriage, but it seems that they were actually quite fond of each other. They were a happy marriage. They got along quite well. So it, was sort of one of those happy ending, it all worked out. Alice grew up at Althorpe, and she was the daughter of wool merchants and the Spencer family. And so she had been trained as a young child. She could read, she could write, she could do needlework and kind of had all of the proper gender training to be a good wife. But she certainly was not raised to know how to manage an estate like Latham and Knowsley. So it was through her first marriage that also her own education continued. And her father-in-law, Henry IV Earl of Derby, was instrumental in teaching her how to manage an estate. It's quite famous that Henry, the 4th Earl of Derby, his estate was quite large compared to, his household was quite large compared to other stately homes at the time. So a lot of people would comment that Alice was learning how to manage a medieval house, not a Renaissance house, but she lived in the Renaissance period. And this was something that she continued later on in her life. She always had enormous staff compared to all of the other peers and her contemporaries. And so it gave the impression that she kind of was a little bit hoity-toity, is the term that people in the 19th century would use about her. But she really learned how to do that here, because this is the kind of estate that she was educated in managing. And her relationship with Ferdinando was essential for that. Together, they were major patrons of William Shakespeare and other poets and playwrights of the age. They performed entertainments. They hosted entertainments here. They hosted entertainments at Latham. And that was actually an essential part of her education, her continued education too. So I think, when I started looking at the world through Alice's eyes, I realized we often think that education for women stopped in the early modern period as soon as they got married. But in a way, really, for Alice, her education was kind of kicked up a notch once she got married, because that's when she really started to learn about how to be a patroness and how to be a lady of a great home. As Lady Derby alluded to earlier, Ferdinando's life didn't end very happily. They lived happily and had 3 daughters, Anne, Frances, and Elizabeth. And when Elizabeth was quite young, her father, Ferdinando, mysteriously fell ill. He was out riding his horse one spring day, and at first the account was that he was riding too rigorously and came home and was sick. But then as his kind of condition suddenly worsened, there were thoughts that perhaps he had been poisoned. There were thoughts that perhaps he had been bewitched. I don't know as a historian how you prove that somebody was bewitched, but it was certainly something that they believed was possible, and they believed may have been a force that was acting against him. So on his deathbed, Ferdinando, kind of as he was coming in and out of consciousness, drafted a will. And in his will, he left everything to, Alice was actually pregnant at the time. And so in his will, he stipulated that if she gave birth and it was a son, everything, of course, would be to pass to her son. And if not, everything should go to Anne, his eldest daughter. And then if she dies without issue, then it goes to her middle sister and so on down the line. When he died, Alice was quite beside herself, and there's actually a couple letters in various archives sent by Alice where she had to apologize to people for her behavior at his funeral. And it seems actually her behavior was just, she was so grief-stricken that she was kind of overcome with emotion, and it was embarrassing to her. And so she apologized. She wrote these apology letters to, for example, Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury. One of these letters is to him saying, I'm sorry for the way I behaved, and I'm so grateful to have your family's support. And she desperately needed his family's support, because as soon as Ferdinando died, the earldom passed to his younger brother, Edward, who became the 6th Earl of Derby. And Alice, I don't know if you have this phrase here in the United Kingdom, but in America, we would say she started circling the wagons. Meaning that she was realizing that she was going to be in for a massive legal fight if she wanted to control any of the properties, or have them passed to her children the way that Ferdinando had wanted on his deathbed. So she started to petition the second gentleman in this portrait, the very austere Thomas Egerton, he was from Cheshire. And he was a very promising kind of upstart lawyer who worked for the Stanley family. He worked for her father-in-law. And so she started to kind of build a relationship with him so that he would help her defend the will. And ultimately, I'll go back to some of this later, but ultimately one of the quintessential steps in her legal strategy was to marry her lawyer, and then to marry her middle daughter to his son, so that her legal pursuits became their legal pursuits. And it was an extremely shrewd strategy that worked very well for her. So Alice spent most of the 1590s, when she wasn't patronizing William Shakespeare, and other writers. She spent most of the 1590s in court battling her brother-in-law. But her argument started to change over time. And some of this was certainly under the advice of her second husband, Thomas Egerton. She started to say, no, my husband, Ferdinando, he loved his daughters so much. He loved them all equally. He was just delusional and out of his mind because of the witchery and the poison and the illness and the rigorous riding. So he didn't know what he was doing. And what he actually meant in his will was for all three of my daughters to be named co-heiresses, which is a very convenient claim to make, but also not at all what the will says. But when you're married to your lawyer, who is Queen Elizabeth's keeper of the Great Seal and essentially the head of equitable courts in England, he starts to say, yes, this does make a lot of legal sense. I do believe that that is actually what Ferdinando Stanley had in mind when he said, I want everything to pass in whole. He meant in whole to all three of my daughters. So together, Lady Alice and Thomas Egerton can work out this legal strategy that ultimately her three daughters are named the Stanley co-heiresses and split up the estates equally. And then, as needed, they would then sell land back to the sixth Earl of Derby as he was trying to kind of rebuild the estate. So it's one of the most well-documented inheritance lawsuits in this period. And it ultimately ends in 1607 with a private act of parliament that settles the entire affair. But it leaves Alice and her three daughters in extremely strong positions to continue to kind of wield the law and their legal influence throughout this period. So I wanted to keep always these women in my research kind of together, even though Alice always remains kind of the central figure of my Stanley women. There's not a portrait of Anne, the eldest daughter. So I use her signature from her first marriage to Lord Chandos. I use her signature as a stand-in because we don't know what she looked like. And this portrait of the middle daughter, Frances, you saw also in the state dining room here, and an engraving of Elizabeth. They all go on to have these very prosperous marriages. Anne marries ultimately Lord Chandos, and then Frances marries her stepbrother, which is unusual in this period, but happens. She marries the first Earl of Bridgewater, and Elizabeth marries the fifth Earl of Huntingdon. So Alice does a very good job, and it's also part of her inheritance strategy is to try and arrange prosperous marriages for each of her daughters and create kind of their own lines from there. So when I look through this quagmire of legal documents and always trying to keep these women at the center of everything, what they really do is give us an opportunity to kind of rethink the way that early modern women navigated the law. And that's what I was particularly interested in. And this is possible because in the case of these women, enormous family archives have survived. All of the Spencer papers are on deposit at the British Library and available and accessible. And a lot of the family papers are actually in Los Angeles. And I'm the curator of manuscripts there at the Huntington Library in San Marino, which is just about 8 miles away from downtown Los Angeles. And this is just one portion of our stacks that contain, this is part of the Ellesmere collection. Ellesmere is Thomas Egerton's family. So there's multiple generations of the Stanley family reflected through these papers because of marriage. Henry Huntington, the founder of the Huntington Library, no relationship whatsoever to the Earls of Huntingdon. It's not confusing at all. Also acquired the Earls of Huntingdon's archive in the 1920s too. So he really brought together to Los Angeles these enormous archives that together they make up about 50,000 individual items that are all cataloged individually. They are used in our library's reading room every single day. They are the third and fourth most consulted collections. at the library. At the Huntington, we have 12 million items in our library. We're one of the largest libraries in North America. And there's not a single day that goes by that we're open where this collection doesn't circulate in our reading room. It is consulted every single day. That's how important these archives are. So they are some of the best documented women outside of the royal family in Renaissance England. And I really wanted to just always kind of keep Alice at the center of it because archives are big and confusing, and I needed someone like Alice to kind of serve as my guide through them. So through these kinds of collections, these women are documented with letters, court documents, poems, dedications, household accounts, religious notes, libels, cheap print, wills, tombs, buildings, and elegies. So really just to say that this history is just all around us, in paper and in buildings and in tombs. It is everywhere. And keeping Alice at the center of my work, I did that in part because she just simply is the best documented of all the Stanley women for this period. There's just more about her. She lived a lot longer than all of her daughters. She lived to be 77 years old and died in 1637. So 77 is a good long run of it in the 17th century. She also had this reputation for being a force to be reckoned with. And so people talked a lot about her, which meant she shows up in other people's archives too. So I wasn't just tethered to the family archives. I could follow through other collections and see that people were talking about how snarky she was, and how controlling she was, and how beautiful her daughters were, and how good she was at giving sage advice to people who were trying to negotiate marriages for their own families, how well connected she was. And so really, she led me into a bunch of other families as well, just because people were constantly talking about her. And she had a sister who was also a little bit unhinged. And so people were talking a lot about her, these sisters together too. And gossip creates sources for historians. And so you follow the gossip. It's not me, it's my profession. She also, Lady Alice, was extremely litigious. So it wasn't just the inheritance lawsuit with her brother-in-law, but she waged law constantly. She sued a local knight in Hertfordshire because he had chased a deer onto her property and killed a dog that belonged to one of her, a tenant of hers. And so she sued the knight, and then there was all of this litigation back and forth between which side of the hedgerow he was on, and if the deer was his or the deer was her, neighborly disputes that end in lawsuits. She threatened to sue other members of their family over inheritance. When her second husband died, she threatened to sue her son-in-law to take which also meant she was suing her daughter. There were no boundaries in these relationships at all, because she really took her role of amassing landed wealth as a form of power very seriously, with the expectation of the more that she could build up and control, the more she could then ultimately leave to the next generation. And she was quite good at this strategy. And it really just means that as a historian, I feel a little bit as a bad person, because I just hate when families spend time together and get along. Because they don't create any sources. It's only when people are far apart that they write each other letters, and it's only when they sue each other that we get all the nitty-gritty details about how families operated. So it's really the worst thing in the world for historians to have families that are happy living under one roof. So the fact that Alice was quite litigious and often lived far away from her children is part of why she was also so well documented, and what allows me to use her as a window into this world. So this is one of the sources. It's now at the National Archives here about the settlement of this lawsuit, just to give you a sense of the kinds of sources that you follow to work on in this period, this inheritance lawsuit. So in keeping Alice, the Stanley women together, it allowed me to start to trace the dynamics of this evolving friendship, evolving female relationships within a single family. And this actually solves an academic problem, a problem that historians had faced for a long time. The field of women's history emerged in the 1970s as a subdiscipline. But in that period, the focus of historians was trying to define what roles for women were. So it was, what were the expectations of a mother, of a wife, of a daughter in early modern England? And so the questions that historians would ask are things like, what was the political climate of a marriage or of a household in the English Renaissance? Or what impact did something like the Reformation have on gendered relationships within a family? So historians spent 40 years working on these subjects, defining what it was, like what the metric of behavior, of expected behavior or expected opportunities for a woman as a wife or as a mother or as a widow was. And that work was foundational to then be able to move beyond that. You have to establish those definitions. But once you have them, then you can start to ask other broader questions. So the questions that I became more interested in was less about what is a woman's role and more about what were female relationships like. And I was particularly interested in the mother-daughter relationship, which allowed me to then place this network of women within these broader categories of how they built kinship networks, or their literary patronage, or their piety, or their legal agency, or their death and their legacies. And then ultimately, because I was working with this controlled group of women, I was able to find patterns to their behaviors, which allow us to demonstrate the ways that women influence their daughters, which is, something that hadn't really been shockingly studied that much. It's something we all know and we talk about, and certainly there's movies and sitcoms and books about, but there hadn't been a lot of academic work to really understand how politically and legally important that mother-daughter relationship was in early modern England. So for example, this is Lady Alice and her youngest daughter, Elizabeth. Much like the story of Margaret Beaufort, they opted to marry Elizabeth's son, also called Ferdinando, to 10-year-old Lucy Davies in 1623. So Ferdinando was 14, Lucy was 10. This was extremely uncommon at this point. It was extremely young, even by those standards. So people were quite uncomfortable with this match, but Alice actually was the one that arranged it because the Hastings family was in financial trouble. Little Lucy was allegedly an heiress, and so the thought was, we'll bring these families together and all of our problems will be solved. That was not the case, though, because Lucy's family never paid the marriage portion. And Alice quite famously wrote a letter to her daughter saying, you need to have them consummate the marriage because we really need the payment for the marriage. And this is part of the reason why people talked about her, because she said egregious things like this, because what mattered the most was getting the money in the right place. So ultimately, the family sued little Lucy's parents to pay the marriage portion. And throughout all of these archives that I showed you this image of, you can see Alice influencing her daughter, and you can see her daughter then suing her own in-laws for this marriage portion. And all of this people kept talking about because it was such a shocking thing to do, but they were so effective at it that ultimately they did win this lawsuit as well. And Lucy's mother-in-law was forced to pay the marriage portion that she owed. And then they constantly were entangled with her for decades after. The other thing that looking at Alice allows me to do, and by putting her life in chronological order, I can see her age. And that's a very unusual opportunity in the early modern period, to be able to see the life cycle of a single individual person and then how it influences those around them. So this makes her very real to me. This was her marriage portrait when she married Ferdinando Stanley in 1580. And then this at the far end is her tomb that's at Harefield Church in Middlesex, just outside of London. And she's actually, this tomb, she's in there, underneath the tomb. It's not just a monument, it is actually her tomb. So following Alice also then took me not just from Los Angeles to London, and not just from London to Knowsley, but it took me all over England, because wherever these women owned land, there's a record of them. And so it is to say that the UK's, your remarkable local record office system, which is quite underfunded at the moment, but unlike anything else that exists, it is possible to do deep studies of women's history thanks to the local record office system. So it took me to Leicestershire, it took me to Hertfordshire, it took me to the Northamptonshire Record Office and to Warwick Record Office. It's taken me to Lambeth Palace, it's taken me to the British Library, it's taken me to the National Archives, it's taken me here to Lord and Lady Derby's private library here at Knowsley Hall. But it's also taken me into structures and buildings. This is Harefield House in Middlesex, which was where Alice and Thomas Egerton lived starting in 1600. And this little church here is where her tomb is, where she's buried today. And just next to the church down the road, there's, this is her tomb, which it's actually just quite magnificent and just dripping with heraldry. And there's hardly anything on that tomb about her second husband, Thomas Egerton. It is all about the union of the Spencer and Stanley lines. There's one little marble plaque in the back you can see that was added later that explains who her second husband was, but that was not part of the tomb originally. And you can kind of make out these little alcoves underneath the curtain that she's laying on. And in there's little kneeling figures, one of each of her three daughters, with the crest of their first marriages as well. So this is Alice's her chosen representation of how she wanted to be remembered as a wife and as a mother. But it's a very particular and select kind of representation of that. I'll say more about that in a minute. So the other thing that let me say here that Alice, actually in her will, she explained that she had built the tomb herself and she had recently inspected it. So just to say that she didn't leave it up to the discretion of her surviving daughter or any of her heirs. She wanted to make sure the tomb was built to her exact specifications. She went to the church, she looked at it, she gave it the thumbs up, and then a couple of months later she died. So she was kind of as controlling in death as she was in life, but it also meant that she was building not just navigating the period, but she was building a legacy with an eye toward the future, always. So in her will, she also left money to have a set of almshouses constructed down the road from the church. And the almshouses are still there. They're run by the Harefield parochial charities. And today, too, originally they were meant for 6 widows from local communities to live there. But now the apartments have been rearranged because they would be quite small for 6 people. So now 2 widows from the local communities there, either in Harefield or Uxbridge, can petition and live in the almshouses. And I had the great pleasure of meeting the 2 women that lived there a few years ago, and they could not have been more generous. And it was really kind of exciting to see how Alice's vision 400 years ago about local community support was still thriving. And then, of course, that in contrast to the room next door that we were just in. So when I published my book about Alice, I kind of thought I would be done with her once the book was done. But I've just become so tangled up in her silver threads because they really do kind of create this matrix that allow you to continue to ask questions about the ways that women wielded the law, the way they could manipulate the law, the kind of allies that they had with their husbands, with other men in the community, with their daughters, the ways they used print, the way that they used gossip, the way that they used literature, the ways that they used tombs, and the ways that they used architectural structures, all to kind of create very particular images of themselves that would then help other people build upon those legacies. So looking at her really allows one to see with more nuance the ways that women and family and marriage and law and literature and architecture and monuments all kind of come together. And so sometimes it feels like the past is really far away, but then when you just pick your head up just a tiny, tiny bit and you have the right guide, you realize that it's actually quite present with us. Thank you.